Professor Henderson, what I'd like to ask first is if you could give us a brief overview of what you do, where you work, and your main areas of research.
Okay, well, the Centre for Climate Research, where I work, links the science of climate change to issues around economics and policy. So some of our research is to do with the scope for big international agreements on climate change. Some of it is to do with the likely impacts of climate change and all of the associated risks. And some of it is on low carbon options and technologies and how these can be rolled out to mitigate the risks of climate change.
And how strong is the evidence that climate change is happening, that it's really something we need to be worried about?
Well, most of the science of climate change, much of the science, particularly that to do with global warming, is quite simply fact. If you release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it will capture heat. And if you go on doing that for long enough, then it will cause a general rise in global temperatures. This much is accepted by pretty well everybody. But other aspects of the science of climate change are less certain, or at least are disputed. And so we're really talking about risk. And the evidence from all sorts of areas combines to tell us that it is a very serious risk. What the economics tells us is that it's probably cheaper to avoid climate change, to avoid that risk, than it is to deal with the likely consequences. And so by investing in measures to limit climate change, it's a bit like buying an insurance policy. The evidence suggests that it is well worth buying that policy.
So what are we doing and what can we do about it?
Well, I would argue that we need to develop the science specifically to understand the likely impacts of climate change in different contexts. As I said, we need to understand the best ways of avoiding climate change, and this will involve a huge transition to low-carbon energy systems, to low-carbon economies and societies. Finding the most affordable and socially acceptable pathways towards low-carbon economies and society is a tremendous priority. And for this to happen, we may need action on a global scale. From a political perspective, we need to understand the terms on which, major countries like China and the USA might sign up to global agreements on climate change, because at the moment we don't have that consensus.
Right.
And we also need to plan ahead so that we're in a position to deal with the likely levels of climate change which are already inevitable, and even more so for the levels that are likely if we don't get those global agreements, or if we fail to make the transition to a low-carbon economy in the next few years. We need to get better at this, in my view.